best conference in old habits die hard, don't they? Not necessarily the best conference in college football. Welcome to the voice of college football. Appreciate you stopping by for the best in discussion, debate, and analysis based on your participation. Please leave those comments down below. Please like the video and subscribe to keep us rolling here at the voice of college football. So for the SEC, obviously the best conference in college football for 15 years plus, but not necessarily this season. Big Ten fans will say, we're number one. We've got the national championship for a second consecutive year, although we do not carry statistics and results and the metrics in the evaluation from year to year here at the voice of college football. This is simply a 2024-25 conference ranking. Please check out the ACC and the Big 12, and you will find that we not only look at the results, all the results in college football between the conferences, but specifically focusing on the results between the power conferences, but we see the teams because there's a difference when your conference champion beats another conference champion versus your conference champion defeating the 10th best team in another conference. Yes, both are 1-0 records for your particular conferences, but they have to be taken into context, and we have a system to do that. We have seeded the teams in all the conferences, and we are looking at the seeding differences. Also, the winning percentages of the games won by the conference and lost by the conference versus the winning percentage of who they defeated or who they lost to. And of course, we're looking at point differential. Yes, it doesn't matter. A win's a win. 1 point or 50 points, it's a win. But we're evaluating play. Therefore, it does matter when a team wins by 1 point versus 50 points. It's a different evaluation of the quality of the two teams, obviously. All right, let's run down the SEC and let's get to the seedings first and foremost. Number 1 is Georgia. Number 2, Texas. Number 3 is Tennessee. Now, what is this? Okay, here's the deal. For the first time ever in our conference rankings, we have seeded these teams equally from 4 all the way through 9. For the first time since we started conference rankings, we have seeded this collection of teams exactly the same, even though there is technically a standing in the SEC 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Think about it. All these teams went 5-3. All of them either went 10-3 or 9-4. We've got a Texas A&M at 8-5, but obviously they played more difficult opponents for the most part than other teams did. We also have a factor of Bama beat LSU, LSU beat South Carolina and Ole Miss. Texas A&M beat Missouri. Texas A&M beat LSU. On and on and on. Bama beat South Carolina. South Carolina, they defeated Missouri. We could go on and on with the cross references here, but we've got to do this. This is what is fair in making this evaluation. Add up all those numbers of the seedings, divide, and you've got a 6.5 seeding for each one of those teams. Florida's at 10, Arkansas 11, Vandy at 12, Oklahoma 13. All those teams reached bowl play. And of course, Vandy at number 12 is a shocker. They finished 7-6 and played very well outside the SEC, as we will see. Auburn at 14, Kentucky 15 with a disappointing season. And by far the worst team in the SEC was Mississippi State with its first 2-10 record and also first winless season in the conference since 2002-2003. Let's first go to the SEC wins against the Power 5. There were 20 of them for the SEC. That leads college football. 13 losses for the conference against the Big 10, the Big 12, and the ACC. First, the wins. They look like this. Georgia with 2 non-conference wins. Defeated Clemson in a big way by 28 points. Slipped by Georgia Tech in 8 overtimes in a 1-6 matchup. Be looking at the seedings as we go through these games. Texas really did well for the SEC with wins against Michigan, Arizona State, the Big 12 champion, Clemson, the ACC champion. Tennessee, a 3 seed with a big 51-10 win against NC State, who we expected to be better. NC State coming off 9-4 in 2023, faltered to 6-7, and again, the 11 seed. Then we've got this collection of 6.5 seeds in the SEC, and this is why it's so reasonable, logical to do what I did with the seeding process here, because we cannot differentiate from 4 all the way to 9 because it's a huge seeding difference. Bama beat Wisconsin by 32. LSU in the bowl game against Baylor by 13. LSU also defeated UCLA, the 12th seed in the Big Ten. Huge win here for the SEC in regards to seeding. South Carolina comeback win in the fourth quarter against Clemson in the final minutes to win it. And a 6.5 seed in the SEC defeats a 1 seed. Biggest win in terms of a seeding win for the SEC. Ole Miss over Wake, Ole Miss over Duke. Missouri beat Iowa. Good matchup there. Missouri also defeated Boston College. We've got 2 Florida wins outside the conference against UCF and against Florida State. And, of course, Florida State faltered to be the worst team in the ACC. So that's a 10 versus a 17. Arkansas with a bowl win against Texas Tech. So that's a higher seed win for the SEC as they go out with the 11 seed Razorbacks defeating number 7 Texas Tech. Vandy with 2 really nice seeded wins. 4 seed difference against Virginia Tech. They won that on the opening weekend. And then at the very end of the season against Georgia Tech in the bowl game is the 12 seed against the 6 seed Yellow Jackets. Oklahoma defeated Houston. And actually, you wouldn't necessarily think of this on the surface, but Oklahoma, a lower seed in the SEC than Houston in the Big 12. For a second consecutive year, the SEC could not get it done where it counted most in the postseason. Bama losing to Michigan at the Rose Bowl in the 4-team playoff. And then, of course, we had Texas. We had Tennessee. We had Georgia in the college football playoff. Texas played the best, but they faltered against Ohio State in the final minutes in the semifinal. Georgia, Tennessee both lost their initial games. This is what the 13 losses by the SEC look like. Notre Dame over Georgia, 23-10 college football playoff game. Huge implications for the SEC here, as well as maybe the most important game in the entire season for the SEC, as it turned out, because Texas may have won the national championship. They lost to Ohio State 28-14. The 1 seed Ohio State defeated Tennessee in the college football playoff opener in a rout by 25 points. Okay, more postseason games with Michigan over Bama. USC defeated LSU, so that's a 9 seed out of the Big Ten with a 2.5 seed difference win against LSU. Illinois, the 5 seed out of the Big Ten, in a nice matchup with South Carolina, 21-17 for the Illini in the bowl game. Notre Dame defeated Texas A&M on opening weekend. USC also at the end of the season defeated the Aggies 35-31. Miami over Florida, not a huge loss for the SEC. Huge loss for Florida. The program doesn't want to lose to Miami, but a 7 seed difference. The 3 seed in a conference should defeat a 10 seed in the other conference. So that's what we're talking about here with pay attention to the seedings. Oklahoma State ended up, despite a 3-0 start and being a team that made the Big 12 championship game in 2023, the worst team of the Big 12 at 0-9. We did not know it at the time when they came back from 3 scores to defeat Arkansas. And so that's a bad loss for the SEC. As it turned out, Cal beat Auburn. That's bad on all fronts, even though both teams just placed 14th in their respective conferences. Louisville beat Kentucky, Arizona State against Mississippi State before we knew the Sun Devils were that good, but not necessarily a damaging seeded loss by the SEC as the 16 seed Mississippi State falls to Arizona State by a touchdown. Add it all up, and the 20 wins by the SEC were against teams that were seeded a combined 35 spots lower. So that makes sense. Higher seeded teams should defeat lower seeded teams. And as we see this play out from conference to conference, it happens about 90% of the time. In the losses, it's almost exactly the same, where in those 13 losses, the SEC teams were seeded 35 spots lower. The reason I put the pluses and minuses the way I did, which seems to be counterintuitive, is because I want to show a positive result for the conference versus a negative result for the conference. So that makes total sense there. Now, the SEC did play a bit better in regards to dominating the games, winning by about 15 points per game, plus 311 in points total, minus 155 in the losses, losing by just about 11 or 12 points per game against the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the ACC. Now let's get to winning percentage. So in those 20 games against the other 3 conferences, those SEC teams won 190 games and lost 81 this season. They won 70% of their games, and they won those 20 games against some pretty good football teams that won 61% of their games. So the SEC won all 20 of these matchups. So if you're going to line up a team that wins 70% of its games against a team that won 61% of its games, you would think they would win, 6 out of 10. Maybe not even that high a percentage. Well, the SEC won all 20 of these matchups. And in terms of conference winning percentage, it's even closer. So these are very like-seeded teams going up against each other, with the SEC winning 54% of its games, those teams that won the 20 games against the Big 12, the Big 10, and the ACC. But they took on teams that had just about the same winning percentage and won all 20 of those games. Now let's look at the losses. So these teams in the SEC that lost those 13 games went 103-67 overall in 2024. Their conference record was just over 500, 54-50. Now, the conference record of the teams that they lost to isn't necessarily accurate for this reason. A lot of Notre Dame in here, or at least a couple games against the Irish, and of course they had no conference record. So those are 2 games that the SEC lost out of 13 against a Notre Dame team that would have gone, 7-1, 8-1 in a conference, but there's not a conference record there. So against the other 11 teams that the SEC lost to, those teams went 53-41, 56% winning percentage in conference, almost a 70% winning percentage. And so just matching it up like we did and explained with the wins, teams that won 60% of their games lost to teams that won 70% of their games 13 games in a row. So not necessarily a great look for the SEC. You would consider the worst losses to be LSU as a higher seed than USC, losing that game. Texas A&M, a higher seed, also lost to USC. Arkansas, 5 seed, higher situation in the SEC, losing to Oklahoma State in particular. And then, of course, the SEC, the big games, the truly big games that matter, were losing college football playoff games to Ohio State and Notre Dame. The SEC did not lose one game to the group of 5 this year. 29-0. I think that's pretty substantial. Even though we're not seeding the teams and looking at exact matchups, we look at a few right here. But the SEC did not drop any of these games. We just looked at the ACC. They lost 8 games against a group of 5. The Big 12 lost 3 games against a group of 5. Again, the SEC perfect, including 2 nice wins by Oklahoma and Florida against Tulane. Bama with a win against South Florida. The FCS did not win 1 game against the Power 5. Usually 1 or 2 sneak through with big upsets. Did not happen in 2024. The SEC 15-0 in those games. And again, 20-13 in the Power 5 matchup. So throw it all together and got the SEC. It's 64 wins, 13 losses outside the conference. Does that mean they're number 1? Does that mean they're number 2? The Big Ten won the big games at the end of the year. The SEC played better in the regular season. Guess what? The Big Ten is next. Then we put it all together. Then if we get a good enough response, we do a live stream and we bring your comments and questions forward. We take your calls and we match up the conferences as we do better than anyone right here at the Voice of College Football.